Right as the world goes is only in question between the equals in power, while the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Thucydides, History of the Peloponnesian War. Good morning, everybody. It's your favorite aspiring revolutionary here, a wandering author, reminding you that we are all the authors of our own lives. As always, my message remains the same: spend less, live more, earn your freedom with frugality. Today we're going to continue looking at the Archaic Age in Greece. Just a few comments before. The most interesting aspect of history to me is seeing how humans lived back in the day, right? We have this tendency to think that humans have always kind of lived the same way, and in many ways our ancestors are very similar to us. But just think about, like, they didn't have internet, they didn't have cars. Life was a lot different, and they still shared so many similarities with us. Okay, so Athens, Sparta, and Corinth were basically large villages at the dawn of the Archaic Age. Remember that at the end of the Bronze Age collapse, there was basically like a dark age before the traditional dark ages. And suddenly, at the last half of the 800s, the 9th century BCE, they begin to found settlements rapidly, like literally one every other year. And by the end of the 700s, they're going to have outposts that stretch all the way up to Britain, all around the rim of the Mediterranean, Egypt, Spain, all of these countries, which the primary driving factor behind this is something surprisingly modern: profit, money, right? So textiles, slaves, spices, perfumes, they were all traded from the Near East, and individual Greeks would build personal fortunes on these trades. And then Greeks' history begins to evolve from individual city-states, polises, interacting with each other, to one of alliances. And this is spurred on by the development of these trading networks, kind of like globalization, right? So the individual Greeks also began to develop like a sense of identity, like what it meant to be Greeks. This isn't fully cemented until after the Persian Wars, whenever Darius tries to invade the Hellespont. But you're probably familiar with that if you've ever seen the movie 300. That's about the Greek and Persian Wars. And by the time Homer is writing his poems in the 700s BCE, there were already words that they would use to describe Greeks as a whole, like the Ionians or the Danons. And then here is another quote from Thucydides, who's one of the earliest historians we have on this period. In his book, History of the Peloponnesian War, he says that war is a matter not so much of arms as of money. Surprisingly modern, right? Now, the most prosperous Greeks of the Archaic Age were the long-distance traders who facilitated commerce. So that's been lucrative since the dawn of humanity. Pretty interesting. And these elite citizens began to fund the colonies that they were settling privately. A lot of these colonies, they were funded in order to basically give the poor a better opportunity of the day. And then the Athenian historian Thucydides tells us also that in those days, piracy was not yet a source of shame, but was even quite honorable. So that was in his book, Histories. In other words, the Archaic Greeks were the Vikings of the Mediterranean. They started to dominate the sea trade, which I'm sure probably helped them become the powerful entities that they end up becoming. And we also start to see the rudiments of politics. In fact, the word politics means matters pertaining to the polis. So the polis is like a city-state. This is what Athens, Sparta, Thessaly, Corinth, all of these places are polises. So basically like one large central city, and then they're surrounded by these farmlands. And the individual citizens, now citizenship was kind of restricted, generally property-owning males. But the governments were referred to as like the Athenians, not Athens. So they held a lot of value on participating in public affairs, just like Aristotle says in his book Politics. Now, citizenship started to cultivate a more egalitarian spirit in these communities. So instead of viewing people as lesser because they didn't have wealth. Like if you were a citizen of the state, then you were equal. It didn't matter how much money you had or not, which is also surprisingly modern. And then another aspect of this area that was incredibly interesting to me is like this is where we start to see the roots of numerous constitutions. Plato and Aristotle both talk about the different kinds of government like that you can form. Aristotle, and I will go over his book Politics after I finish the Nicomachean Ethics, but I know in there he distinguishes two types of constitutions. One is like a true constitution aims at the general good of everybody that is in the city. And then deviant constitutions are basically like what we would call corruption today, where they favor one group of the people above the rest. Also, surprisingly similar to today, despite being over 3,000 years ago. And Thucydides, self-control was the chief element in self-respect, and self-respect is the chief element in courage. So they valued virtue, and courage is one of the virtues that they valued the most back then. The first people to benefit from all this increased trade and political opportunities would develop into like a new aristocracy in Archaic Greece. And I thought it was interesting because I kind of believe it demonstrates what we would call the opportunity cost today. So basically the Greeks that didn't participate in the world lost out because they weren't there early, and the ones who were there the earliest are the ones who benefited the most. So there's to all the risk takers of history, right? Now, the Boeotian poet Pindar wrote, "In the hands of the good lies the noble piloting of cities, handed from father to son." So, again, lineage historically has been very important and continues to be today. In fact, there are plenty of statistics showing that your parents' level of success is a huge determinant in your own level of success. And that's been kind of true since antiquity. The kids whose fathers formed the first governments benefited from the formation of those governments, in other words. And Aristotle wrote that political offices in Athens were filled according to the qualifications of noble birth and wealth by men who called themselves the Eurytridae, or the descendants of good fathers. So again, lineage, heritage, incredibly important at the dawn of antiquity. And I thought this was just funny. Aristotle talks about how the elite politicians in Lesbos at the time, they would use clubs to beat their opponents into submission. So violence was part of the governing process, I guess. And then lyric poetry started to really take off, which also gives us kind of like a glimpse into what like the common folk back then were thinking. And Theognis, one of the most prolific lyric poets of the time, suggests that when the bad become the good should become even better. He actually thought that this competition was valuable because when he talks about the bad, he really means like the weak, and then the good, he really means the strong. So the competition between earning the right to rule was a concept back then. We could probably use that a little more today, earning the right to rule. The Olympic Games also got developed during this time period. I thought this was interesting because they weren't held in one city, they were held in multiple cities. So just think about the logistics of travel. Like the same like politicians and elite, like the wealthiest people of their society would travel between these games. And then the athletes had a ton on the line too. If they won, they could end up being worshipped as heroes, basically. And then Sparta, lovely Sparta, I had to mention it today. Finally, they would award the victors of the Olympic Games the right to fight alongside their kings in battle. Now that right there is a prize worth winning, right? So, that's really all I've got on ancient Greek history today. A few takeaways. So after the Dark Age that happens at the end of the Bronze Age collapse, there's basically no writing for a long time. Civilization kind of slows down for a bit, but then what emerges afterwards is even greater than the First Age. We see way more international trade, and another takeaway was the most prosperous Greeks, as measured by their attainment of power and wealth, those end up being the ones who define their culture. They're the ones that are going to all the Olympic Games. They're also the ones that are going to these things called symposium, which are basically classy drinking parties back then. Plato and Aristotle both write about them. Another key takeaway, lineage, really important. If your father or your parents were relatively successful as Greeks, then that success paid off in their descendants. Also, as always, they're incredibly similar to us. From all the quotes from Thucydides that I mentioned about, even the way their culture is defined, basically, there's some very strong roots to our culture. It's unsurprising to me that we're the descendants of these folks. And then they start to, that's really what y'all I've got for you guys today. Next time we'll start to talk more about the actual formation of the political states, like the policies, and like how that looks. And we'll start to get into some of the more contemporary or popular eras of early Greek history. So far, the only names that most people would know that we've talked about is Homer, in like the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? Tomorrow, we'll talk some more about early American history, and later this week, we should begin traveling once again. So, we will be having some more content. I got another blog post up yesterday. Got several more that I need to finish up before the end of this summer. But I landed a 180 on the skateboard yesterday, so that was pretty cool. And then I've just been doing like a lot of paid writing so I can afford all of the travel that I'm trying to do towards the second half of this month. But yeah, that's really all I've got for you guys today. Your favorite aspiring revolutionary here, a wandering author, reminding you that we are all the authors of our own lives. As always, my message remains the same: spend less to live more, earn your freedom with frugality. What are you guys doing in order to inspire, uplift, and empower your communities today? Because this world isn't changing unless we all do our part. You can count on me to do mine daily.